Guys, welcome back to another installment, part 4 of the JFK presidency series. For this one, as you probably already kind of picking up on, I'm going to have another chunk or two extra parts than like the Teddy Roosevelt one, but these ones I'm keeping briefer. I'm trying to break it into really small installments that are maybe a little bit easier for you to just like process and digest. Each one kind of on a different big topic or thing event that happened during Kennedy's presidency. So for part 4 today, this is something that I would definitely add into the Cold War notes page. The next chunk, part 5, is going to be something that'll tie more into like the civil rights notes page, how he kind of interacted with that whole movement. But for this one, definitely we're covering a big civil right or Cold War type event. The heading that I'd want you to put into your Cold War notes, and this one will definitely end up being on some quizzes. Actually, I'm going to do a whole quiz just about the Cuban Missile Crisis, a reading quiz where you're going to read some text and then answer some questions that correspond to it. We've done that a few times in the past. But in addition to that, you can just expect to see this on other quizzes we're doing for class, and I will at least have 1 or 2 questions on the semester 2 exam that'll tie into the Cuban Missile Crisis. So some pretty important stuff here. Now, you have your heading for the Cuban Missile Crisis. One thing I would put in right out of the gates on it is my opinion, and this is kind of a subjective thing, but I think most historians would agree with me, this is probably the closest the world ever came to an all-out nuclear exchange, like a World War III breaking out, a nuclear holocaust. Man, what a disaster. And if this had played out a little bit differently, or if somebody other than Kennedy had been president, who knows how it would have played out? Like if Richard Nixon had won the election of 1960, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here talking today and running class. We might be living in a zombie apocalypse, like post-nuclear exchange world. Then again, maybe Nixon would have diffused the situation in an even better way. I don't know. That's kind of playing the what if game. But one thing we do know is the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came dangerously close to an all-out nuclear exchange. And I think definitely there are some other tense situations that have happened from the end of World War II on to today. But I think by far this one takes the cake as for what could have potentially been the biggest disaster in a potential like World War III. So what ends up playing out? Well, to give you a little bit of a background on how this all, kind of hashes out, the Soviets feel like, so Russia, the Soviet Union, is kind of irked, and they've been upset for quite a while that America has territory really close to the Soviet Union, but the Soviets don't really have any territories that are like team communist right next to America. So what am I talking about there? Well, like West Berlin, that is kind of in Eastern Europe, and that is a little chunk, that piece of that city is American territory, and we have an American military base there. Also, the United States is in that NATO alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Well, we are on friendly terms with the country of Turkey, and the United States has ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads on them in Turkey. We have them in Western Europe. Those, if you just look at a map, are pretty close to like Moscow and the Soviet Union. So the Soviets, and I kind of get it from their angle, they feel threatened by American missiles and military presence being pretty close to their borders. Then you look at it the opposite way. Well, the whole Western Hemisphere, North and South America, I mean, now it's kind of like going back to the Monroe Doctrine that America said, this is our turf. We're not going to directly have an empire and control these places, but we keep a pretty close eye on it. And we keep these other Latin American countries on a short leash and watch what they're doing. And up to that point, none of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, so North and South America, had gone communist. Now, that doesn't mean they're all democracies just like America, but we can work with those governments. Nobody is like in a close alliance with the Russians. All right. Well, that's all about to change. So we had talked a little bit about the Bay of Pigs invasion, and that was a reaction to Cuba had a communist revolution really right before Kennedy gets elected as president. So that all is changing now. Now the Soviets didn't go down there and like take over Cuba. If they had tried to do that, America would have gone to war with them and tried to prevent it. What happened in Cuba was a more kind of organic, natural thing. It was actually like legitimately Cuban people that were upset with the current military like dictatorship that was going on there, and they had reasons to be upset about it. Cuban people actually have a communist revolution. And then they just kind of voluntarily say, hey, we're going to be closer allies with the Russians. So, man, that different situation. It wasn't like the Soviets went in and directly intervened in Cuba, but you have this situation now where Cuba has gone over to the communist team, the communist side, and they look at now Cuba and Fidel Castro, the guy that is the dictator, the communist dictator of Cuba, when Kennedy gets sworn into office, he knows America is not happy about that. The Bay of Pigs just happened, and he's able to hold on to power, but he realizes that, if America had come in and actually used their Air Force, Castro and his supporters would have been goners, and America could have easily toppled that regime. The only reason Kennedy really didn't do that was he was worried it would provoke the Soviets, and then they would go attack West Berlin or South Korea or who knows where. He didn't want it to escalate. So Castro, and I can totally see where he's coming from, he feels very vulnerable and threatened. He knows America does not like him being a communist dictator that close to the American border. Remember, Cuba's 90 miles south of Florida, so it's too close for comfort. He feels like, and now think of this, in more modern day politics, most of you are probably familiar with like what has gone on, how America has a tense situation with North Korea. And Kim Jong-un has, that regime has developed nuclear weapons, and now they have like intercontinental ballistic missiles. And man, a couple years ago, that was really blowing up. And we were worried that, what if North Korea tries to nuke Hawaii or Japan or California? When that was all playing out, I was like, man, that is not going to happen. Even though a lot of people were freaking out about it. If you look at it from the North Korean perspective, or back in this era, Fidel Castro's perspective, think about this. Any country that has ever had nuclear weapons, all right, any country, from World War II on, if you have nuclear weapons, none of those countries have ever been invaded by an outside power. Think about that. Nobody messes with you if you have nukes. It doesn't matter if you're a smaller, weaker country, if you don't have that good of a military, Navy, or Air Force. If you have nukes, nobody messes with you because they're worried that if you invade, you have time to push that nuke button and send them. Well, who knows? You might go fry a few of the other guys' cities. It's a pretty good deterrent. It's an insurance policy, having nuclear weapons, that any country that has achieved, that level of technology and has nuclear missiles, hey, they get left alone, and whoever's in power gets to kind of stay in power. That's what's going on with Fidel Castro in Cuba in 1963. Now, Castro's very much worried that America's going to try to do like a Bay of Pigs invasion again and topple his regime. Castro does not have good enough scientists that he can develop nuclear weapons on his own, but he knows, hey, now I'm friendly with the Soviet Union. And the Soviets very much liked that Cuba had gone communist. They know that's a black eye to America, and it really pisses America off to have a country that close to us that's on the other guy's team. And they feel like, hey, that's like a tit for tat, a fair trade, because there's a lot of democracies and American allies that are close to Russia. So they feel like from their perspective, from the communist side, they feel like they're evening out the score, and Castro wants to get Soviet nukes in on his island because he feels like if the Russians let him have some nuclear missiles to protect his island, that, man, there is no way America will ever try to mess with them or invade and topple his regime. Okay? Now, from the opposite end of that, say you're Kennedy, say you're an American or in the American military. If there's nuclear missiles in Cuba, they can strike American cities and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, if you were over in the Soviet Union, say you're over in Moscow, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and you launch a missile at the United States, America would have enough time. It's going to take 20 minutes, 30 minutes for that missile at supersonic speeds to come across the Atlantic Ocean, but we would have a chance at shooting that missile down and taking it out. But a missile that gets launched from Cuba, 90 miles south of the American coastline, we would not have enough reaction time with the technology of the 1960s to shoot that missile down. And they can basically, if there's nukes in Cuba with the missile technology of that era, they can basically hit any American city on the East Coast. So, all the cities down south, Atlanta or Tallahassee, Orlando, Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, Detroit, Chicago, all of those cities are very vulnerable to a nuclear attack if there's missiles in Cuba. So also remember, this plays into it. Kennedy's one big weak spot was a lot of people felt like, I don't know if we can trust this guy to stand up to the Russians, to be tough on communism. Like Eisenhower or Nixon, Kennedy's opponent, they were seen as very tough on communism, but maybe not that good with things like the civil rights movement. Kennedy was seen as, okay, this guy knows what's going on. He's good with domestic policy and dealing with American people, but he's not that great at dealing with the Soviets. Also, if you watch the chunk of notes before this, remember, for the Berlin crisis, where the Berlin Wall gets built, Kennedy had gone into a meeting with Khrushchev, who is the Soviet premier, and he thought he was going to be able to go in there and bedazzle him and charm him, through that meeting, and that did not happen. Khrushchev kind of bullied Kennedy and came out of there thinking like, man, Kennedy's a punk kid. He doesn't know what he's doing. I can push this guy all around. He ain't going to do nothing. That was kind of the feeling that the Soviets came out of their first meeting with Kennedy. So anyway, that all considered, that makes the whole situation right for this to become a huge debacle. So Castro, sorry, it's not a ghost. It's my cat trying to get into the pantry. Anyway, so Castro asked the Soviets for missiles as an insurance policy. The Soviets, okay, and you jot this stuff down however it would make sense in your own words in your notes. The Soviets agree to that, and they feel like, yeah, we don't want the Americans to go topple that regime. We like having a communist country over there. Sure, let's send a few nukes over there on ships, and we'll set them up, and it'll still be Russian soldiers kind of controlling them, but if America attacks you, we'll launch those, and it'll be a good deterrent. It'll protect you. From the Kennedy perspective, as soon as American spy planes flying over see this happening, see missiles getting set up, we freak out. The U.S. military says that is a non-negotiable no. So right here in the second bullet point, JFK comes under tremendous pressure from the American military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's like the top general in the Army, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Navy. Those top guys are all telling him essentially, we cannot allow this to happen. America is very vulnerable. We're going to have to go attack them, Mr. President. We have to go. We cannot let those missiles come online, because it took them like several weeks to get the missiles up and running and set up. So Kennedy comes under tremendous pressure to invade Cuba. This time, not with Cuban refugees, but the American Marine Corps and Navy going down there and smashing them and just toppling the regime, taking out the missiles. However, Kennedy knows if he does that, and there are actual Russian soldiers down there with Russian equipment, and this is a communist nation, like kind of on Team Russia, 100%, that will provoke another attack. The Russians will retaliate somewhere else in the world, and then he's worried things will escalate and it'll become a World War III, right? Neither side really wants that. Now, from the Russian perspective, Nikita Khrushchev, who's their top guy, kind of like their president, he basically tells all of his military guys, because they're kind of worried, like, what if America doesn't let this happen and they come in and invade Cuba? The Russians, honestly, they did not want a World War III to break out either. And Khrushchev says, I've already talked to this Kennedy guy. He's a wimp. He's a weenie. He's not going to do anything about it. I can push him all around. So you see how this whole situation, like the way things played out and the dynamic and just the politics going on, just, oh man, it made it highly likely that this was going to turn south and go in a horrible direction, and a big war was going to break out. Now, Kennedy, the military guys were kind of telling him, you kind of have, I guess, two options. You can either go invade the island and take the missiles out, or you can do nothing. But if you do nothing, then they're going to set up those missiles. And I could say this, now Kennedy doesn't realize nobody knows he's going to get assassinated in the near future. He's thinking about his reelection coming up in the not too distant future. If Kennedy let missiles get set up in Cuba, Russian missiles, 100%, there is no way he would have gotten reelected. He would have been out of there. The American public would have lost faith in him. So he knows that his political career is done, and it's a big threat to America if he lets those missiles get set up. So both of those things he feels like are bad options. Probably doing a military strike looks a little bit better, but he doesn't want World War III either. So he kind of, and I'll give Kennedy credit for this, he thinks outside the box. He sits with guys that are not his generals. He talks to his brother, Bobby Kennedy, several other people in his cabinet, and they end up deciding to take some middle ground, and they do a blockade. Essentially, they take the U.S. Navy and they surround the island of Cuba. That doesn't do anything for the 10 or maybe 12 missiles that are already getting set up in Cuba. Doesn't do anything to stop that, but it prevents any more missiles from coming in. So the U.S. Navy blockades Cuba, cuts it off from the rest of the world. Now the Soviets say, hey, that's illegal. You're not allowed to do that. They complain at the UN, but bottom line, America's basically like, we don't care. We're not letting any more missiles come in. If you try to cross the blockade, we'll shoot you. And actually, like, shots are fired across bows, and like the U.S. and Russian navies, they don't actually shoot each other, but they get really, really close to doing that. This all plays out, and it's like a 13-day standoff. If you're interested in this little episode of history, there's actually a really good movie called 13 Days. It just goes over the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's outstanding. I've showed it in class before. This year we don't have time for it, but I highly recommend it if you're interested in this kind of Cold War type stuff in the Kennedy era. Anyway, while this is all playing out, tensions get really high. Both sides are worried that, like, Kennedy continually under this 13-day period, the generals come to him every day and say, how much longer are you going to let this go on? We have to go invade. Come on. You can't drag your feet on this, Mr. President. Khrushchev over in Russia, he's hearing this all heating up. I don't really know the dynamics playing out there, but like, even though he is kind of a dictator, he's not an all-powerful dictator like Stalin anymore. He answers to other powerful people in the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. So he's kind of in a mess too. Eventually, now this all happens behind closed doors. The world is aware this is going on. This is hitting the evening news, what's happening. But this whole part of it, secret deal, is not really made public until years later. Essentially, Bobby Kennedy, who is the President Kennedy's younger brother, and he is currently the Attorney General, he meets with a Russian ambassador. They just go and have a talk, and they're like, come on, man, this is getting out of hand. What can we do? Let's cut a deal. And basically Bobby Kennedy goes into that meeting and says, look, you have to take the missiles out of Cuba. If we have to, we'll go to war over this. We're not going to let it happen. But Bobby Kennedy is also like to the Russian guy, hey, you understand my brother's coming up for re-election, and his big weak spot is that people are worried he's not tough enough on communism. We'll cut a deal with you. We will negotiate, but we can't make this public because if it looks like President Kennedy is coming off weak and giving things up to the Russians, that kind of ruins his chances at getting reelected. Get what I'm saying there? So eventually, behind closed doors, there's some letters that get sent back and forth, and we end up coming up with this deal that, okay, the Russians say, the Soviets agree, we will take our missiles out of Cuba. You don't have to worry about that. Done deal. That Cuba stays communist. America, you have to promise us you will not go in and overthrow Castro, but if we take our missiles out and you give us that promise, we're good there. But this is what we're asking of you. And it's kind of, I think this was actually a fairly good compromise. The U.S., the United States, had to agree to remove our nuclear missiles from Turkey, which actually the missiles we had there were kind of older, outdated, were scheduled to be updated with newer, better missiles. So basically, we're just not going to do that. And they're not going to make that public either. That doesn't get made public for a long time because Kennedy doesn't want to look like he was negotiating essentially what was really happening. He doesn't want to appear like he was weak or gave anything up. He just wants to be like, I stopped those missiles from going into Cuba. But anyway, that's the deal that gets cut behind closed doors. And it kind of averts this whole crisis where, if a different person had been president or if a different guy had been the premier of the Soviet Union, this could have all gone horribly wrong. Like I said quite a few times, it's the closest the world ever came to like an all-out nuclear exchange between world superpowers. But luckily, fortunately for all of us, that didn't happen. And I do think both sides learned some lessons from that. And then coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but there is a phone in the president's office, in the Oval Office, that's like a red phone. And if you pick that up, it is a direct line to whoever the leader is of the Soviet Union, or today it's Russia. So we go to Vladimir Putin, where these two guys, like the leader of the United States, the leader of the Soviet Union, or Russia now, they have a direct phone line to each other. And that was established after this because it was kind of like, hey, if things start getting out of hand again, we want our leaders to be able to talk to each other right away and diffuse the situation. So hopefully we don't ruin the whole planet with nuclear weapons. All right, that's all I got for you for the Cuban Missile Crisis. I will also have a short, about 1 or 2 page statement on this that gives some details that I didn't get into, and we will have a corresponding quiz that ties into it. So don't forget to check that out and go ace that quiz. If you read the text really close, you should get everything right and get 100% on it.